The chair beside her at the altar was empty. White ribbon tied across the armrest like a bandage over something that would never heal. Grace stood at the end of the aisle in her mother's veil, and the only family on her side of the church was me. One old man in a borrowed suit holding a bouquet he did not know how to carry, standing where her mother should have been, but that is not where this story begins. To understand how we ended up in that church with an empty chair and a lie that had been growing for 3 years, I need to take you back to a Tuesday morning in October when the air smelled like wood smoke and the leaves along Maple Street had just started to turn. My name is Thomas Edward Mercer. I am 67 years old. I live in a town called Whitfield, Virginia. Population just under 4,000 if you count the dogs. I drive a 1994 blue Ford pickup with a dent on the passenger door from the time Margaret backed into a mailbox waving at the pastor. I have a golden retriever named Buddy who sleeps on her side of the bed. My routine has not changed in 6 years. I wake at 5:15, coffee in the same percolator Margaret bought at a yard sale, back porch until the fog lifts off the ridge. Then Hal's Diner on Main Street, third stool from the end, 2 eggs over easy with rye toast and black coffee. Hal knows not to talk to me until the second cup. After breakfast, I fix whatever needs fixing. Leaky faucets, stuck hinges, a wobbly shelf at the church. People in Whitfield know me as the quiet man who shows up with a toolbox and never sends a bill. That is exactly what I want them to know. What they do not know, what almost nobody in this town has ever known, is that before I moved here with Margaret 31 years ago, I spent 23 years in military intelligence. I ran field operations across 4 continents. I interrogated people whose names still appear in classified documents. I can read a room the way most people read a newspaper, and I have never once lost that instinct. But those days are behind me. I buried them the same year I buried my uniform in a footlocker in the attic. Margaret used to say something that I carry with me the way other men carry photographs in their wallets. She would look at me, usually in the kitchen, usually while drying her hands on that blue towel she kept by the sink, and she would say, "The truth does not need your permission to arrive, Thomas. It just needs someone brave enough to open the door." She said it when I was avoiding a hard conversation. She said it the last time she could still speak clearly, 3 days before the cancer finally took her voice and then took everything else. Pancreatic. The doctors said 6 months. She got 4. I made coffee for 2 every morning for a year after she died before I finally put the second mug back in the cabinet. Sometimes I still reach for it. Sometimes I talk to the empty chair at the kitchen table. I think she hears me. I think wherever she is still drying her hands on that blue towel and waiting for me to be brave enough to open the next door. Grace is my daughter, my only child. She has her mother's eyes, the kind that look right through you without making you feel exposed. She teaches 2nd grade in Richmond, about an hour east of Whitfield. She drives out every other Sunday for dinner, apple pie in the fall, lemon in the summer. She sits in her mother's chair and tells me about her students, the quiet ones, the stubborn ones. Grace is the reason I still set the table for 2. She is the reason this story nearly destroyed me. She met Victor Ashland in the spring, 3 years before that empty chair appeared in the church. He was a financial consultant at a firm in Richmond. 36 years old, tall, clean-shaven, the kind of man who wears a suit like he was born in one. His shoes were always polished. His handshake was firm but measured, like everything else about him. Grace brought him to dinner on a Sunday in May. The dogwoods were blooming along the front walk. Margaret had planted those trees the year Grace was born. Every spring when they opened, I felt her standing beside me. Victor walked up the porch steps carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my grocery bill for the week. He smiled and extended his hand. "Mr. Mercer, it is an honor. Grace has told me everything about you." I shook his hand, looked at his eyes. They were steady, practiced. The eyes of a man who had rehearsed this moment. I told myself that was nerves. I wanted to like him. For Grace, for Margaret, for the empty space at my table, I wanted this man to be good. And for a while, he was. He complimented my cooking without overdoing it. He asked about my years working for the government, and when I said it was mostly desk work, he nodded and moved on. He brought Buddy a chew toy shaped like a bone. Victor came to Sunday dinners regularly. He helped me carry firewood in from the shed. He washed dishes without being asked. One Saturday in July, Grace cut her hand slicing tomatoes in my kitchen. Nothing serious. Victor was beside her before I could reach the drawer for a bandage. He held her hand under the cold water and said something so quiet I almost did not hear it. "I have got you. Just breathe." Grace looked at him with an expression I had not seen since she was a little girl, looking up at me after a nightmare. Complete trust. For one moment, I thought maybe I had been wrong to feel that tightness in my stomach whenever he walked into the room. Maybe the instinct was rust. Maybe 23 years of reading people for threats had made me incapable of recognizing someone who was simply kind. That night, after they left, I sat on the back porch with Buddy and listened to the cicadas in the dark and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That the man holding my daughter's hand under cold water was exactly who he appeared to be. I almost believed it. I wanted to believe it the way you want to believe the road ahead is clear when something in the air already smells like rain. But the truth does not need your permission to arrive. If this story is already making you feel something, I hope you will stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so stories like this one keep reaching people who need them. The first thing that bothered me was small. So small I almost did not register it. It was Thanksgiving. Grace and Victor had driven out from Richmond. I had spent the morning cooking the turkey the way Margaret always did, rubbed with sage and butter, slow roasted since dawn. The house smelled like her, like home, like everything that mattered. We sat down to eat. I said grace the way I always do, short and simple, thanking God for the food and the people at the table and the woman who was not there, but whose presence I still felt in every corner of this house. When I finished, Victor smiled and said, "That was nice, Thomas. My church back home used to do something similar, but with a bit more structure." He laughed. It was a warm laugh. Easy. But something about the way he said my church back home made my ears tighten, because in 6 months of Sunday dinners, Victor had never once mentioned a church. He had never mentioned a hometown. He had never mentioned parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, or a single human being from before the age of 25. It was as if his life had begun the day he walked into that Richmond firm. I let it pass. I told myself people have complicated backgrounds. I told myself not everyone grew up in a town like Whitfield where your history is printed on the back of your birth certificate, but I noticed. The second thing happened 3 weeks later at a diner in Richmond where Grace and I sometimes met for lunch. Victor joined us that day. He was on the phone when he arrived, speaking to someone about a client portfolio. He ended the call, sat down, and ordered without looking at the menu. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that said Linda, brought his coffee and accidentally set it down too hard. A few drops spilled onto the saucer. Victor looked at the saucer. Then he looked at Linda. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He simply said, "I would appreciate it if you could bring me a clean one," and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with coffee. It was the voice of a man who believed that the people who served him existed at a lower altitude. Linda replaced the saucer without a word. Grace did not react, and that silence from my daughter, that absence of the instinct I had raised her to have, told me more than any argument ever could. You learn things about a man not by how he treats you, but by how he treats the person who cannot do anything for him. Margaret used to say that too. She was right about most things. She was right about all the things that mattered. The third thing was at Christmas. Victor gave Grace a necklace. Silver. Elegant. She put it on and it looked beautiful against her collarbone. Then Victor turned to me and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a watch. Expensive. Far too expensive. I turned it over in my hands and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, the other kind, the kind that comes attached to gifts that are meant to establish a hierarchy rather than express affection. "Thank you, Victor," I said. "This is too much." He waved his hand. "You deserve it, Thomas. You have done so much for Grace." Something in his voice when he said "done so much for Grace" made my jaw tighten, as if raising my own daughter was a service he was now compensating me for, as if I was being paid. I set the watch on the mantel beside Margaret's photograph and never wore it. Grace noticed. She did not ask why. And that was the third thing that told me something was wrong. Not that she did not ask, but that she was afraid to. The fourth thing happened in February. I had driven to Richmond to surprise Grace with lunch. Her favorite sandwich from a place near the school. I parked outside her apartment building and saw Victor coming out the front door. He was on the phone again. I was about to wave when I heard him say something that stopped my hand in the air. "No, they are not coming." I told her they are dead. "It is handled." He walked to his car without seeing me. He got in. He drove away. I sat in my truck with the engine off and the sandwich going cold on the passenger seat, and I felt something inside me go perfectly still. The kind of still that used to come over me in a briefing room when someone slid a photograph across the table, and everything I thought I knew about a situation rearranged itself in a single second. His parents were not dead. He had told Grace they were dead. And whatever the reason, whatever the lie was built to protect, my daughter was living inside it. That was the moment the story stopped being something I was watching and became something I had to walk into. I did not confront him. I did not confront Grace. I went home. I sat in the kitchen and stared at the empty chair across from me. And I could almost hear Margaret saying it. "The truth does not need your permission, Thomas." I went upstairs to the attic. I opened the footlocker. Not for the uniform, not for the medals, for the notebook. The one I used to carry in the field, the one with the leather cover Margaret had given me the Christmas before my first deployment. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to a blank page, and I wrote 3 words at the top. "Who is Victor?" The next morning, I drove to Howell's Diner and sat at my usual stool and drank my coffee without tasting it. Then I went to the county library and sat at a computer in the back corner and did what I had spent 2 decades being trained to do. I followed the thread. It took 4 days, not because the information was hidden, because it was not hidden at all. That was the part that made my chest tight. Victor Allen Ashland, born in a town called Ridgemont, Ohio. Population 6,000. His father, Henry Ashland, had worked at a heating and cooling repair company for 34 years. His mother, Dorothy Ashland, had been a school cafeteria worker for most of Victor's childhood. They were alive, both of them, living in the same small house on Birch Lane where Victor had grown up. Property records showed the house was paid off. Utility records showed consistent payments. There was a church directory from the Ridgemont Community Church that listed Henry and Dorothy Ashland as active members. Wednesdays and Sundays, I stared at the screen. A cafeteria worker and a repairman. Good people, ordinary people, the kind of people who wave from the driveway and know their neighbors' names and send birthday cards to children who stopped calling. I thought about Victor's polished shoes, his dark sedan, his wine that cost more than my groceries, his voice when he said my church back home. And I understood. He was not hiding from danger. He was not running from abuse. He was running from Birch Lane. He was running from the heating and cooling company and the cafeteria and the small house with the paid-off mortgage. He had rebuilt himself from nothing, or rather from something he decided was worse than nothing, from ordinary, from modest, from people who loved him in a way that did not match the man he had decided to become. I closed the browser. I drove home. I sat on the back porch with Buddy at my feet and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. And I thought about a woman named Dorothy, who probably still set a place at her table for a son who had told the world she was dead. None of us knew what the next 3 months would bring. I had no idea that before the year was over, everything in my daughter's life would come apart and be put back together in a single evening. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from right now. I read every single one, and knowing you are out there keeps these stories alive. I did not go to Ohio immediately. I called first. I found a listing for Henry Ashland on Birch Lane in Ridgemont, and I called from my kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon. A woman answered. Her voice was soft and slightly hoarse, the voice of someone who does not get many phone calls and is surprised every time the phone rings. Hello? Mrs. Ashland, my name is Thomas Mercer. I'm calling from Virginia. There was a pause. If this is about the warranty on the I am not selling anything, Mom, I paused. I am calling about your son, Victor. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that kitchen. The kind of silence that has weight and texture and temperature. The kind that tells you everything you need to know about what a name means to the person who just heard it. She did not hang up. She did not speak for almost 10 seconds. Then she said, in a voice that had gone very small, "Is he okay?" "He is fine, Mom. He is engaged to my daughter." Another silence. Longer this time. Then a sound that I recognized immediately because I had made it myself in this same kitchen 6 years ago. The sound of someone crying who has been holding it in for so long that when it finally comes out, it does not sound like crying at all. It sounds like breathing that has forgotten how to work. I waited. I did not rush her. When she could speak again, she said, "He told us he needed space. That was 3 years ago. He changed his number. He stopped coming home. His father drove to Richmond twice, and both times Victor would not see him. We send letters. They come back." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. My knuckles went white. "Mrs. Ashland, I would like to come visit you and your husband. I would like to sit in your kitchen and hear everything. Would that be all right?" She said yes before I finished asking. I drove to Ridgemont, Ohio on a Friday morning in March. 8 hours on the highway. Buddy stayed with Arthur Collins. I packed a clean shirt and Margaret's leather notebook. The town looked exactly like I expected. Small, clean, American flags on porches, a hardware store on Main Street with a hand-painted sign. The house on Birch Lane was a single-story ranch with green shutters and a birdbath in the front yard. A welcome mat at the door said, "Bless this home." Henry Ashland answered. He was a thick man with rough hands and kind eyes, and a flannel shirt washed so many times the pattern was almost gone. "You must be Thomas." I shook his hand. His grip was honest. No performance in it. Dorothy was in the kitchen. The table was set with coffee and oatmeal cookies. The kitchen smelled like brown sugar and vanilla. She stood when I walked in, and I saw her eyes searching my face for something, for some piece of her son. I sat with them for 4 hours. They told me everything. Victor had been a quiet boy, loved numbers, won a math competition in 8th grade. Henry drove him 2 hours to the state finals. Dorothy packed sandwiches and lemonade. Victor placed third, and Henry told him he was the proudest father in Ohio. Victor got a scholarship to a university in Pennsylvania. Business school, he came home less. The calls got shorter. Then one Thanksgiving 3 years ago, Victor called and told them he needed distance. He said their lifestyle was holding him back. He said he could not build the life he wanted while still connected to the life they had given him. Dorothy repeated those words the way you repeat something carved into your memory with a blade, connected to the life they had given him, as if the life they gave him was a chain and not a gift. Then the line went dead. They had not heard his voice since. Dorothy showed me his old bedroom, trophies on the shelf, a quilt on the bed she had sewn herself, blue and white squares with his initials in the corner. She touched the quilt. "I wash it every spring," she said quietly. I do not know why. My throat was too tight to answer. I drove home the next day with the notebook full of dates and details and a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with the road. I had spent my career uncovering lies that governments told. This was the first time I had uncovered a lie that a son told about the people who loved him most, and it was the worst one I had ever found. The engagement party was set for June. Grace had planned it herself. A garden event at a restaurant outside Richmond, white tents, string lights, 60 guests. She asked me to give a toast. Victor had told everyone his parents had died in a car accident when he was 19. He told the story with the perfect amount of grief, just enough to make people touch his arm and never ask again. He was good at it. I will give him that. That decision would turn out to be the most important one I ever made. I called Henry and Dorothy in May. I told them about the party. I told them I wanted them there. Dorothy went quiet. "Thomas, we do not want to cause trouble. Mrs. Ashland, your son told my daughter and 60 people that you died in a car accident. You are not causing trouble. The trouble has already been caused. You deserve to be in that room, not for drama. Because you are his parents, and someone needs to say that out loud." Henry got on the line. His voice was steady, the way a beam is steady when it is holding up an entire house. "What time should we be there?" He said they would drive through the night if they had to. Then he said something that made me sit down. "Thomas, she still makes his favorite meal on his birthday. Pot roast with carrots. Sets a place for him every single year. I held the phone for a long time after he hung up. The weeks before the party moved slowly. I told no one. Not Grace, not Arthur, not Hal at the diner. I carried the plan the way I used to carry classified briefings, close to the chest, behind a face that gave nothing away. Grace called me the week before. She was excited. Her voice had that brightness in it that reminded me of Christmas mornings when she was 7. Dad, everything is perfect. Victor has been so amazing through all of this. I know he wishes his parents could be there. He gets quiet sometimes when we talk about it. I think it still hurts him. My stomach turned. I stared at the wall. I know, sweetheart, I said. I am sure it does. The morning of the party, I put on the suit Margaret had picked out for me years ago. Navy blue. She said it made my eyes look honest. I stood in front of the mirror and I could feel her behind me, not as a ghost, but as warmth, the way sunlight feels on your back when you do not realize you have been standing in it. I drove to Richmond. The garden was beautiful, white chairs, string lights, a table with photographs of Grace and Victor in silver frames. I looked at the photos and felt the weight of every smile built on something that was not real. Henry and Dorothy arrived at 4:30. I had arranged for them to wait inside the restaurant. Dorothy was sitting with her purse in her lap. She was wearing a blue dress with white flowers, the same colors as the quilt on Victor's bed. Henry stood beside her in a brown suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, the suit of a man who had not bought new clothes in years. Dorothy looked up at me. Is he here? Not yet, but he will be. Her chin trembled once, then it steadied. Henry put his hand on her shoulder. Two people who had driven 9 hours to stand in a room where their son had told everyone they were dead. They were not there for revenge. They were there because a door had finally opened and they were brave enough to walk through it. The guests arrived. Victor arrived. He moved through the garden with the easy confidence of a man who believed every piece of his constructed world was firmly in place. He shook hands. He kissed Grace on the forehead. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Thomas, you look sharp tonight." I looked at his eyes. Still steady, still practiced, still performing. "Thank you, Victor," I said. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do." The toast came after dinner. Grace had asked me to speak first. I stood at the front of the garden under the string lights with 60 people watching me and my daughter sitting beside the man who had told her his parents were buried in a cemetery that did not exist. I held a glass of water because I do not drink. I looked at Grace. I looked at Victor. I spoke slowly. When my wife Margaret was alive, she used to say something that I have carried with me every day since she left. She would say, "The truth does not need your permission to arrive. It just needs someone brave enough to open the door." I paused. I let the words settle. I looked at Victor. His smile was still in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. The smallest movement. A shadow crossing a window. I have spent my life believing that the people you bring to the table tell you everything you need to know about who a person is, I continued. Tonight, I want to make sure we have the right people at this table. I looked toward the restaurant door. I nodded once. Henry and Dorothy Ashland walked out into the garden, Henry in his brown suit, Dorothy in her blue dress with white flowers, both of them blinking against the string lights, both of them looking across 60 faces for the one face that mattered. Dorothy saw him first. Her hand went to her mouth. Henry put his arm around her waist, not to hold her back, to hold her up. I watched Victor's face. I had positioned myself to watch it. The color drained from his skin, the way water drains from a cracked glass, slowly at first, then all at once. His jaw went slack. His hand, the one holding his wine glass, trembled. The glass tilted. Grace reached over and steadied it. She looked at Victor. Then she looked at the two people standing in the garden entrance. Then she looked at me. "Dad? Victor?" I said quietly. My voice was calm, level, the voice I used in briefing rooms when the information was going to change everything. "I went to Ridgemont, Ohio, in March. I sat in your parents' kitchen on Birch Lane for 4 hours. I drank your mother's coffee. I saw your bedroom with the trophies on the shelf and the quilt she made you with your initials stitched in the corner. The garden was silent, 60 people holding their breath. Your father worked at a heating and cooling company for 34 years. Your mother spent 20 years in a school cafeteria so you could have what they did not. They drove you to math competitions. They packed you sandwiches and lemonade and told you they were the proudest parents in Ohio." I paused. And 3 years ago, you told them their lifestyle was holding you back. Then you changed your number and told my daughter and everyone in this garden that they died in a car accident. The sound that came from the crowd was not a gasp. It was the specific sound of 60 people simultaneously recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the man sitting at the center of that garden. Victor did not move. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The performance had ended. The stage had collapsed beneath him, and he was standing in the wreckage with no script and no character to hide behind. Grace stood up slowly. She looked at Victor. Then she turned and walked across the garden to where Dorothy Ashland was standing with both hands pressed against her chest. Grace stopped in front of her. Dorothy looked at Grace the way a woman looks at rain after 3 years of drought. Grace extended her hand. "Mrs. Ashland," she said, her voice breaking on the second word. "I am Grace. I am so sorry." Dorothy took her hand. Then she pulled Grace into her arms and held her the way only a mother can hold someone, completely, immediately, without reservation. Henry stood beside them. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet. He looked at me across the garden and nodded once. Not a thank you. Something deeper. Something that did not have a word. I nodded back. Victor sat in his chair. He had not moved. The arrogance was gone. The Polish was gone. Everything he had built was lying on the ground around him, and for the first time I could see the boy underneath. The boy from Birch Lane who had won 3rd place in a math competition and whose father had called him the proudest moment of his life. He was still in there, buried under 3 years of pretending to be someone he was not. Victor looked at his mother. Dorothy looked back at him from over Grace's shoulder. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Her face said everything. "Come home, just come home." He stood up. His legs were unsteady. He walked toward her the way a man walks toward something he is terrified to touch because he knows the moment he does, he will not be able to hold himself together anymore. He stopped 2 feet away. "Mom," he said, 1 word, 1 syllable. The most honest sound he had made in 3 years. Dorothy let go of Grace and opened her arms. Victor walked into them, and the man who had told the world his parents were dead collapsed against his mother like a building coming down. Henry put his hand on his son's back. The 3 of them stood there in the garden under the string lights while 60 people watched in silence, and I stepped back. I found a chair near the edge of the garden. I sat down. Buddy would have been useful right about then. The evening air smelled like jasmine and cut grass and the candles on the tables. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said if she had been sitting beside me. She would have taken my hand. She would have looked at those 3 people holding each other in the middle of a garden, and she would have said, "See, Thomas? The door was there the whole time. You just had to be brave enough to open it." The weeks after the party were quiet. Grace ended the engagement. Not with anger, with clarity. She told Victor she loved parts of him, but she could not build a life with someone who had erased the people who built him. Victor did not fight it. He drove to Ridgemont the following weekend. Dorothy called me. She was crying, but it was different this time. The kind that comes from something returning instead of something leaving. "He is sitting at the kitchen table," she said. "He is eating pot roast." My chest felt like something clenched for months had finally let go. Grace moved closer to Whitfield. She started coming to Sunday dinner every week. She sat in her mother's chair. She asked me questions about Margaret she had never asked before. What was her favorite song? What did she smell like? What did she say when she was scared? I answered every one. In September, she brought a man to dinner, a quiet fellow named Daniel who taught history at the high school in the next county. "Mr. Mercer, it is nice to meet you." I looked at his eyes. They were not practiced. They were not performing. Honest and a little nervous in exactly what they appeared to be. I liked him before he sat down. I joined a veterans breakfast group at the church on Thursdays. 6 old men eating scrambled eggs and telling stories our wives used to pretend they had not heard 400 times. Arthur Collins saves me the seat near the window. One morning in October, exactly a year after this whole thing began, Grace called. She and Daniel had a daughter. They named her Margaret. I sat on the back porch and watched the fog lift off the ridge. Buddy put his head on my knee. "Little Margaret," I said to nobody. Little Margaret. When I was young, I thought strength meant never showing what you felt. I thought it meant keeping your face still and your voice level and your hands steady no matter what was happening inside you. The wars taught me that strength meant doing the hard thing even when every part of you wanted to walk the other direction. But aging taught me the truth. Real strength is not silence. It is not control. It is not the absence of fear. Real strength is driving 9 hours through the night in a suit that does not quite fit anymore, to stand in a garden where your son told the world you were dead because the door finally opened and you were brave enough to walk through it. That is strength. That is love. That is everything Margaret tried to teach me before she left. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who loved you quietly from a small house on a quiet street, share it with them. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment telling me what moment hit you the hardest. Sometimes the people who need these words the most find them through you.